Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. We are delighted this evening to be joined by Vanessa da Silva Baptista of University College London, who will be delivering a talk entitled How to Make a Ring Jump in the Manner of a Locust, Animating Small Objects in Late Medieval European Manuscripts. Vanessa is a PhD student at UCL, supervised by Professor Sophie Page and Professor John Sabathy, and is also a postgraduate teaching assistant on the module Making History. Her research explores the medieval understanding and appreciation of magic tricks, particularly sleight of hand and chemical tricks preserved in medieval manuscript recipe collections and formed domestic play and popular science. Her articles include Playing with the Mind, Magic Tricks in Late Medieval Europe, from the Open Library of Humanities, published in 2023, and the chapter Using Theory-Based Approaches to Embed Evaluation within a Small Specialist Performing Arts Institution, co-authored with Dr. John Rainford in the book Theory of Change, Debates and Applications to Access and Participation in Higher Education, edited by Samuel Dent, Anna Mountford-Zimdars, and Kieran Burke, published in 2022. She has also contributed to a number of blogs, including the Multimedia Craft of Wonder blog, where she wrote a piece entitled Medieval Magic Tricks, Jumping Rings, Running Eggs, and Twisting Chickens, Inner Lives blog, where she wrote on magic and humor in late medieval ages, and the Wellcome Collection's Early Medicine blog, where she wrote on John Dee's crystal. In addition, she has served as a co-convener and panel convener at a number of conferences and seminars, such as Scientific Recreation/Recreational Science in Late Medieval and Early Modern Europe in July 2022, Models of the Mind, Molds for Behavior, Using Illusion to Teach and Entertain in Medieval Europe, Quo Vadis, Arts and Humanities Research in the 21st Century Conference in July 2021, and the UCL Interdisciplinary Medieval and Renaissance Studies Seminar from 2018 to the present. And in 2022, she was appointed as the Royal Institution's Freer Prize Fellow. Vanessa, thanks so much for joining us this evening. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you. Shall I take it away?
Absolutely, please do.
Excellent. So, between 1271 and 1283, Richard de Grimhill, a low-ranking Worcester noble, compiled a recipe collection containing playful tricks, including instructions to turn water into wine, light a candle with water, and animate small objects such as eggs, rings, and roasting chickens, alongside romances and fables in his household book, now Oxford Bodleian Library, MS Digby 86. Due to their surprising effects that complicate the relationship between what was seen and what actually occurred, I call these recipes magic tricks. Now, aside from occasional references to 16th century texts, such as Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, published in 1584, which is often considered the first English text to describe illusionist magic, the scholarship of magic tricks and illusionist magic, and especially amateur engagement with these, is usually focused on the 18th and 19th century. Now, this paper is going to argue instead that recipe collections such as Richard's are evidence of a common tradition and appreciation of magic tricks as a form of private and domestic entertainment and play in Europe from as early as the 13th century. Using a single category of magic tricks, animation tricks, this paper will demonstrate how magic tricks can unpack medieval people's attitudes towards and conceptualizations of cognition, practical crafts, and experimentation. They reveal a playful medieval attitude towards the manipulation of human perception, the exploitation of craft substances, and a widespread appreciation of chemical knowledge. So my research has shown that magic tricks are a prominent genre of medieval recipe literature that was consumed by a broad range of medieval society for various reasons. So over the course of my doctoral research, I've discovered 100, predominantly 14th and 15th century manuscripts that contain recipe collections which themselves contain magic tricks. Now, most of these manuscripts that contain magic tricks can be divided into 3 broad groups: the medical, the technical, the miscellaneous, based on their content. There are a few other outliers can be described as theological or astrological. As far as possible, I also try to ascertain whether these manuscripts can be placed in a monastery or a university, or within a non-institutional setting, such as the lay household, according to their contents and codicological features. I also tried to ascertain in what manner these magic tricks were collected in, whether they were collected in formal texts, meaning here texts with titles and structures, or more ad hoc personal collections. And you can see a breakdown of that data here. So these categories then represent really broad intersecting communities, revealing that these magic tricks were enjoyed by various medieval audiences for diverse purposes and in diverse places. But what are medieval magic tricks? So medieval magic tricks are recipes which produce surprising effects that seem impossible. They can include sleight-of-hand tricks, such as tricks for cutting and restoring rope that are still performed today, and chemical preparations, which often share substances and techniques with medieval artisanal practice, particularly pigment making and metalworking. So, for example, the substances on the side, sulfur, mercury, quicklime, egg whites, and techniques like grinding, mixing, and heating. So, for instance, a common recipe allows a performer to appear to burn their hand without injury by first coating the hand in egg white and then sprinkling it with ground sulfur. And these substances were often used together in pigment making to make red pigments. When the fire is applied to the hand, the ground sulfur will briefly spark before exhausting itself due to a lack of fuel, while the egg white, due to its wateriness, provides a protective coating for the hand. So these more chemical tricks expose close links between the household and the workshop, indicating a playful medieval approach to technical knowledge. So while I've identified several categories of magic tricks, this paper is going to focus on animation tricks. This is because they are some of the most common recipes in my corpus, making up 10% of all recipes and appearing in a third of all my manuscripts. They are a significant category of magic trick and were potentially familiar to a range of people in the Middle Ages. The effect of moving a small object was clearly very desirable, and this is illustrated not only by their ubiquity, but also by the variety of methods in which this is achieved. So they form part of the medieval juggler's repertoire, making use of sleight of hand and prop-based methods. And they also made use of chemical substances. They are therefore particularly useful tools for interrogating the concept and role of magic tricks in medieval Europe. So in the remainder of this paper, I'm going to be taking you through 3 sections. First will be dedicated to sleight of hand and object-based animation tricks that will illustrate how medieval people understood magic tricks as a form of entertainment that manipulated the perception. Second, magic tricks that animate small domestic objects with mercury will highlight the close connections between craft practice, domestic play, and experimentation. And finally, those that use a combination of mercury, sulfur, and saltpeter demonstrate that this experimentation was not always practical. So, animation tricks that don't rely on chemical substances for their execution account for less than 1% of the magic tricks in my corpus. While they are therefore a small and limited category, the context of their survival demonstrates how medieval people engaged with professional performances of illusionist magic. Now, as I said, these tricks are part of a long-standing repertoire of illusionist magic tricks, appearing also in Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, which we mentioned earlier, but also in J. Proversal of Première Partie, which was also published in 1584, and which is frequently cited as the first European text to contain instructions rather than just descriptions of magic tricks. Prior to these, non-chemical animation tricks appear almost exclusively in the Secrescen Philipposaurus, a 13th century Latin text compiled in England, which survives in 25 14th and 15th century manuscripts. While nominally this is a text on the several liberal arts, aiming to take each in turn, it's in practice a collection of craft recipes and other practical and amusing material. So for example, the grammar chapter, rather than providing instructions on how to write accurately, instead contains instructions on how to make pens and inks. Rhetoric focuses on playful riddles, and dialectics on deceptive tricks that cause deceptions of the senses. Now, it is in the dialectic chapter of the Secrescen Philipposaurus that we find some of these non-chemical tricks to animate small domestic objects. These are achieved in 2 ways. So first, there are tricks to make an egg or a coin appear to move by using wax to attach a fine hair to these objects, and tricks to make an apple move on the table by putting a beetle inside of it, assuming you can get it in without it being crushed. So outside of the Secrescen Philipposaurus, similar tricks are only found in 5 other 14th and 15th century manuscripts, 3 of which have an entirely different trick for making an egg move by inserting a leech into it. Unlike most texts containing magic tricks, which retain only the instructions for their operation, the Secrescen Philipposaurus offers comment on and context for its recipes. So these non-chemical animation tricks are characterized as acts that are specifically performed by jugglers, appearing in a section titled Concerning the Deceptions that are called Jugglersticks, and being immediately followed by tricks for cutting and restoring rushes, making a rush appear to grow, and freeing hands that are tied behind the back. So this places them directly in the context of performed professional public entertainment. The author-compiler also presented their animation tricks as cognitive acts, the coins and eggs movement is only seemingly, so it's only thought to be done by the magical art. And similarly, it will only be thought by many that the apple moves by itself. These tricks highlight that the compiler of the Secretum Philosophorum considered magic tricks as a specific type of performance based on the misdirection of the attention of a willing audience. Misdirection is a central concept to the performance of modern illusionist magic and forms the basis of every illusion. So for context, all magic tricks consist of an effect and a method. For a magic trick to be successful, the audience must experience the effect without discovering its method. Now, the importance of misdirection is quite explicit in the Secretum Philosophorum. So for instance, in a recipe to make a rush appear to grow, the reader is instructed to first pretend to search for a rush with which to play the trick, whilst actually concealing and folding a much longer rush in their hand. So this folded rush is then substituted for the discovered rush and then pulled so that this newly discovered rush appears to grow in the performer's hand. The Secretum Philosopherum's acceptance of an entertaining magic performed by jugglers that relied on misdirection is clearly echoed in the writings of contemporary theorists. For example, William Auvergne, the 13th century Bishop of Paris, described performances of sleight of hand that included placings and movings, which were commonly called handlings and shufflings, which could inspire great admiration until their methods were made known. A century later, in the 14th century, a French philosopher, theologian, and counselor to King Charles V, Nicolas Oresme, argued that the skill and knowledge of one person, which could include tricks of perspective with mirrors, sleight of hand, and transformations such as those employed by jugglers in their performances, could appear incredible to those less adept. However, he emphasized that these acts were not acts of magic, but rather acts of trickery that simply manipulated humanity's faulty perception. Implicit in all of these writings is the necessity of an audience's exercise in rationality in the experience of an illusionist magic. This is congruent with the notion of active disbelief, which modern illusionist magicians claim to be integral to the experience of illusionist magic. So an audience practices active disbelief by knowingly and willfully doubting the reality of their experience of a seemingly impossible event, despite all sensory perception indicating they've truly experienced something impossible. So it's the opposite of the suspension of disbelief, where you suspend your doubt. This is you actively trying to get to your doubt. The Secretum Philosophorum is very clear about the necessity of the skepticism. The Dialectica chapter opens by stating that it aims to teach the reader to distinguish between what is true, what is false, and what is apparently true. So those things that have the appearance of truth whilst being false. And this can be read as an attempt at teaching the reader active disbelief by presenting them with various scenarios in which the impossible is demystified. This concept of active disbelief is also present in medieval literature. So for example, in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in 1392, the Squire's Tale portrayals a fictional audience that seriously appraised a mechanical horse and other marvellous items before acknowledging that they could be produced by a multitude of methods, including the work of jugglers who performed entertaining wonders of sleight of hand or technical illusion using mirrors. So they could be an appearance made by some magic, as jugglers do in great feasts, or produced naturally by compositions of angles or via sly reflections. Scott Lightsey has convincingly argued that in the Squire's Tale, and in medieval literature more widely, the exercise of reason was necessary to the experience of wonder. This is similar to active disbelief. For an audience to experience a magic trick, they must be certain that what they are experiencing is not truly magical. They may not be sure how an event came to pass, and they may offer various conflicting solutions, as the audience in the Squire's Tale did, but they must not believe that they've witnessed anything outside of human capacity. This emphasis on the exercise of rationality continued to be central in descriptions of magic tricks. So returning to Reginald Scott, he echoed the Secretum Philosophorum in claiming that he was simply aiming to rationally explain how things which appear miraculous might be achieved through completely natural means by outlining the methods of various jugglers and stage tricks. He further provides some insight into the relationship between performers and their audiences, claiming that a performance of magic, of illusionist magic, was licit, just so long as always the performer confessed at the end. There was no supernatural actions in their performance, but just skill, human skill. So, turning now to chemical methods. So Richard the Grimhill's collection of amusing tricks which open this paper contains several animation tricks to make an egg or an empty bladder run through the house, a chicken or fish turn on a spit, or a ring jump in the manner of a locust. Rather than sleight of hand, these effects were achieved by inserting mercury into the object and placing it in a warm place, sometimes explicitly in an oven or fire. Now, mercury is used to animate small objects 28 times in my corpus, and this accounts for about 5% of all recipes and nearly half of all animation tricks. These recipes are found in all types of manuscript, so the medical, technical, miscellaneous, in those that are clearly domestic or institutional, in both formal texts with titles and structures, and informal collections written in the vernacular and in Latin. So unlike those I've just discussed, they are some of the most ubiquitous recipes in my source base, and some of the most clearly domestic, animating only very easily found items. And I've got a list here in order of frequency. So a loaf of bread, a chicken, a ring, an egg, an empty bladder. Tricks that use mercury to animate small objects suggest that chemical and specifically craft knowledge was relatively widespread in late medieval England, and that there were very close links between the workshop and other spaces like the home, the university, and the monastery. Some texts seek to provide an explanation for how these recipes may have worked, implying a lived experience of mercury and its properties. So an early version of the 88 Natural Experiments of Rhasis, a Latin text comprising of largely chemical tricks and surviving in 114th and 215th century English institutional manuscripts, contains a recipe to animate a hollow ring with mercury. And it explains that once the mercury-filled ring is heated in the fire, it will jump until it cools because the mercury flees from the fire. Now, this isn't too far from the truth. Mercury is a liquid metal at room temperature, so it changes its shape to fit its container, like a liquid, and it expands when it's heated like a metal, which are properties that until relatively recently were used in domestic thermometers for household healthcare. Now, if sufficient heat were applied, the mercury within the ring could expand to fit this container and then be driven out of the hole from which it was inserted, potentially generating sufficient force to move the object. This suggests that the compiler of the 88 Natural Experiments of Rhasis had some understanding of how mercury behaves when heated, implying that specific and accurate technical knowledge was circulating outside of the medieval workshop in English monasteries and universities from at least the 14th century. Similar expressions are also found in Richard's domestic collection, suggesting an even earlier and broader democratization of technical knowledge in England. His recipes state that the ring will continue to move until it weakens, that the chicken and the fish will jump and turn in the fire when the heat reaches the mercury, and that the bladder or ring will run through the room until the mercury has been set forth, presumably meaning expelled in this context. So medieval magic tricks can then be understood as the process of making the familiar fantastic, of taking common items and using them in uncommon ways. Recipes that animate small objects like this were clearly inspired by the observation of and playful experimentation with mercury's properties, likely initially by specialist artisans. Mercury was an important craft substance, particularly in the making of the red pigment vermilion and in metalworking. And in both these cases, it would have been heated or used near heat. A medieval craft person, therefore, would have been in a unique position to observe and manipulate the properties of mercury. Albrecht Classen, in his study of leisure from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, argued that it's a fundamental concern in human existence to experiment playfully with alternative conditions. Further, Paul Binsky has similarly argued that in medieval art, the element of the ludic allowed for orthodox or familiar ideas and methods to be applied in unorthodox or unfamiliar ways. Now, while Classen's argument is focused predominantly on games, sports, riddles, and literature, and Binsky's on art and architecture, both arguments can be extended to magic tricks. They are the unorthodox use of common substances in alternative conditions. So when mercury is heated, a frequent occurrence in the workshop, it gives the impression of movement. Having observed mercury's behavior, the craftsperson could then apply this knowledge in a different setting, one of recreation rather than work, and for a different purpose, not to purify metal, but to make an object appear to move. Most artisans applied their trade from or in their homes, and this porousness of the workshop may have facilitated this playful experimentation. If the artisan experienced the same space as both potentially social and vocational, private and public, at different times, perhaps they could also interpret and use the materials and processes of this space for different purposes. This playful experimentation and reinterpretation of convention is a feature of all medieval creativity. So as the Squire's Tale that we discussed earlier demonstrated, Chaucer was able to use the codes and conventions of the Romance drama, which allowed magic to be taken for granted, to present a scene of critical evaluation of clearly magical objects to interrogate the line between technology, human capability, and magic. Returning to craft, the architect Villeneuve de Hornacourt, who was working in the 13th century, experimented with wood, pulleys, rope, and other materials common to his trade to design mechanical wonders, such as pointing angels and nodding eagles. So if magic tricks are the product of playful experimentation on the part of artisans, how do they make their way into domestic collections like Richard's? So magic tricks are part of a general democratization and domesticization of artisanal craft that was occurring in the late medieval Europe. So this was a time when craft knowledge was being transmitted out of specialized spaces. Being previously concentrated in monastic, cathedral, or guild workshops, increasingly into the 14th and 15th century, artisanal crafts, and specifically those related to the production of books, were also practiced in court workshops and in wealthy gentry households which produced their own books. Later on in the period, they were also practiced by lay literate amateurs who also were trying to fill the need for books. As Pamela O'Long and Sylvie Nevy have argued, this was also a time of greater correspondence between craftspeople and literate individuals who visited the workshop to record practice for posterity rather than for practice, thereby facilitating this wider dissemination. The workshop thus became a trading zone for the exchange of craft knowledge, including adjacent technical knowledge, such as magic tricks. And as the following section is going to show, this wide dissemination of craft and technical knowledge significantly impacted how substances and their properties were used and understood in late medieval Europe. So surviving in one 15th century copy of the 88 natural experiments of Brazos, sulfur and saltpeter are added to recipes for animating a ring with mercury. Now, this specific adaptation only occurs 11 times in my corpus, exclusively in the Latin, predominantly in formal texts, and always in manuscripts that apply in institution environments, so in a much more limited context than those previously described. So the domestication of and experimentation of substances, illustrated by recipes that use mercury alone, can be related to a mounting interest in craft practice among learned, non-specialist elites who commission scribes to collect technical knowledge as a form of self-aggrandizement without any intent to practice them. And we can see this in craft and art technological treatises. When these recipes are not collected in informal collections, they are most frequently collected in encyclopedic volumes that record current and past practice and which also include recipes that don't work or don't work quite as intended. Now, these recipes, the ones that don't work or don't work as you'd expect, are likely the product of several factors. So they could be an overzealous misunderstanding of chemical properties, hypothetical extrapolations made from commonly held principles, or once they become written down, the usual errors introduced by manuscript copying, and the influence of a literary tradition. Tricks that add sulfur and saltpeter to mercury to animate a ring were clearly inspired by theoretical assumptions derived from a working knowledge of gunpowder, perhaps informed by public performances rather than direct experimentation. So for a bit of background, gunpowder consists of sulfur, saltpeter, and carbon. It's an explosive composition, and when it's heated, the sulfur will ignite first and burn the carbon in turn, and this resultant heat causes a reaction with the saltpeter that produces oxygen that further aids and sustains the combustion, which then produces a rapid expansion of force that can lead to the propelling of objects. So that's how like fireworks and artillery work. In recipes that add sulfur to saltpeter and saltpeter to mercury, it's likely that the mercury itself would have been superfluous to the reaction. So these recipes would only work under specific circumstances. So if exposed to high enough temperature, the sulfur encased in the ring could potentially ignite, and the saltpeter release sufficient oxygen, leading to a rapid expansion of gases within the ring that could propel it forward. This reaction, however, would be considerably more violent than that of mercury alone. So rather than jumping until it cools, the ring would likely perform one very forceful leap as the gases were expelled from it. The addition of sulfur and saltpeter to animation tricks was partially encouraged by the late medieval European conception of substances and their effects as multi-purpose and capable of serving a variety of ends. Gunpowder had a dual identity as a plaything and a weapon of war in late medieval Europe. So from its first arrival in Europe in the latter part of the 13th century, gunpowder's explosive properties were variously used on the battlefield as artillery and for recreational pyrotechnics at the theatre or during coronations. The ambiguity of gunpowder and its effects is even highlighted by one of its first commentators, Roger Bacon, who described a relatively harmless child's rocket composed of gunpowder inserted into a tube of parchment, which could be easily adapted into a weapon to produce a much stronger explosion simply by enclosing the powder in a much more solid material and stopping it with a piece of artillery. And finally, turning back to my corpus of magic tricks, there are various firework recipes in my corpus that aim to make fire fly through the air in the shape of a dragon or up a cord, which further illustrate gunpowder's potential identity as a plaything and the flexibility of substances in late medieval Europe. So uniquely amongst most of my magic tricks, these firework recipes record ratios and weights for their components, which demonstrate that in most cases, these recipes were only attempting to yield very small quantities of relatively weak gunpowder that would have been more suitable for use in small-scale pyrotechnics than, for example, the theatre or coronation displays or artillery. So a gunpowder of a composition of about 30% saltpeter will burn, and a composition of 60 to 70% saltpeter can act as a propellant for spherical objects. In my corpus, and specifically in domestic manuscripts, firework recipes usually produce less than 100 grams of gunpowder of between 40 to 60% saltpeter. While these recipes might indicate simply a lack of direct knowledge of gunpowder amongst compilers, they can also reflect the process of medieval readers modifying recipes intended for larger displays or artillery to achieve cheaper, smaller, safer effects for the amusement of their friends and families in equivalent to, say, modern-day firework displays in our gardens. So, having observed or been otherwise aware of the propellant nature of gunpowder, the first compilers to add sulfur and saltpeter to these mercury-based animation tricks likely assumed that it would aid the mercury in this reaction. These recipes are therefore an example of what I like to call the more is more approach. So scholars studying art technological encyclopedias, such as Bernard Guinau and Jean Vizin, have identified that recipes and texts copied data removed from practice frequently directly relate the efficacy of a recipe to the number of listed substances. The educated and curious compilers who recorded these recipes were unlikely to have engaged with workshop practice, but instead made leaps based on the knowledge they had acquired from various sources. These recipes imply that in a learned amateur context, certain methods may have been copied because the compiler knew or thought they knew how substances behaved. However, this modification might not necessarily be simply down to ignorant misunderstanding of chemical processes. Their compilers may have been following a specific logical framework. So Spike Buckler has shown that in late medieval Europe, substances and materials could hold different meanings to different people at different times, or even different meanings to the same person at different times, depending on what they were doing. Along with meanings derived from practical experience, these meanings could include those derived from theoretical assumptions, cosmological associations, or humoral composition. This multiplicity meant, for example, that recipes for pigments included both substances that actively contributed to the creation of the product and those that were included because within the worldview of the producer, they were considered to be congruent to the desired effect. So, for example, adding red plants to red pigments just because they're red. In animation tricks using mercury alone, mercury is understood to be fleeing the fire because of its aqueous properties. As both a weapon and plaything, gunpowder propelled objects via the generation of heat. Rather than simply including these substances because of a sense that the greater the number of substances, the greater the effect, the compilers may have considered the addition to be complementary to the effect. If mercury flees from fire, perhaps they are attempting to add more fire to the overall effect, and consequently to cause the mercury to flee faster and further. These recipes that do not work, then, can be variously read as either an example of a compiler's misunderstanding of chemical processes or evidence of how their specific worldview may have affected what was deemed possible and efficacious. So, to sum up, Animation tricks, which make small domestic objects appear to move using props, sleight of hand, or chemical preparations, demonstrate that in late medieval Europe, magic tricks were engaged with as both a form of cognitive play that manipulated the mind and a form of playful experimentation with chemical knowledge that could be variously entirely theoretical and entirely practical. With the Secret and Philosopher, it's possible to identify, for the first time in Europe, a long-standing tradition of sleight-of-hand magic. Reading this alongside contemporary philosophers and literature demonstrates that much like today, medieval people understood magic tricks and illusionist magic to be an entirely cognitive experience reliant on misdirection and a very specific audience between a transparent performer and a skeptical audience, specific relationship. These magic tricks, and particularly sleight of hand tricks, are just one example of medieval European interrogating their anxieties around deception, the limits of human perception, and the danger of gullibility. Chemical animation tricks demonstrate that this interrogation and limitation of purpose and limitation extended to substances. Recipes using mercury alone were based on the observation of mercury's chemical properties in the workshop. Mercury was found not just in the workshop, but in the home, the doctor's bag, and the alchemist's laboratory. The ubiquity of these recipes suggests that knowledge and perhaps lived experience of mercury and its properties was widespread, implying an even broader level of chemical literacy across medieval society, from artisans to gentry, that most likely include other more domestically useful substances like sulfur. Magic tricks illustrate that in late medieval Europe, substances, their effects, and technical processes were understood to be fluid and capable of serving many purposes. This openness and adaptability of magic tricks is just one example of playful experimentation that can be witnessed across medieval art and craft. Finally, recipes that add sulfur and saltpeter to mercury illustrate that playful experimentation can be a hypothetical exercise based on the theoretical knowledge of substances which combine disparate chemical effects, a form of literary wish fulfillment where medieval people imagined the fullest extent of their ability to manipulate substances and improve upon certain effects. Rather than really merely records of what people did, these recipes were also records of what medieval people wished they could one day possibly achieve. Recipe collections as documents that can themselves be read as play spaces, where medieval people could collect potential realities that allowed them to investigate various aspects of their lives. These aspects included the fallibility of human minds through the collection of recipes that aim to misdirect others, and humanity's potential to effect change in the world by manipulating substances through the collection of recipes that use common substances and techniques in uncommon ways.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. That was absolutely fascinating. It's incredible to see that sort of movement between sort of originally sort of magic tricks in their particular context and the sort of the anthropological reaction to them, and then moving into the way that they sort of related to substances and around workshops and things, the way that people sort of interacted with things and their particular knowledge and the potential implications for that. It's fascinating. There's so many different kind of branches that we can potentially explore off of that. I want to begin just by going back to initially some of the historiography within this field. I appreciate that most of the emphasis has been sort of on the 18th and 19th century, not necessarily on the Middle Ages. Out of curiosity, just why do you think people have tended to focus more on that and kind of overlook some more of these kind of medieval sleight of hand tricks?
Yeah, so I think it's principally because the 18th and 19th century was considered the golden age of magic. So that's when you start to have like performers on the stage, crafting these amazing effects. So we have Jean-Robert Houdin and other like Victorian and slightly earlier performers. And it's a more recorded form of entertainment from that time. There is some scholarship, particularly bibliographical scholarship of amateur books of tricks from, say, the 17th century, which was recently the focus of an exhibition at the Senate House Library, which showed off the Harry Price collection. But I think it's just, it wasn't a clear enough art, and it wasn't a recorded enough thing for people to focus on. They're just, the sources are too hard to get at.
Yeah, I see what you mean, because I guess it's quite sort of fragmented, isn't it? Kind of the source work that one has to work with. It almost seems very eclectic, and almost as if you have to kind of read into kind of other sources to kind of get to the kind of crux of it.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to really, you need to look quite broadly. So I said I had 100 manuscripts, and many of these are informal collections. So essentially someone's notebook that can contain recipes for inks, food recipes, medical recipes. So you need to you need to look at every single page because no one's going to catalog every single recipe. So it's time consuming, and you don't necessarily have, I think, modern historians who are more interested in magic tricks is because of the availability, might not necessarily have access to the manuscripts themselves, or perhaps access to Latin, that sort of thing.
Mhm. Definitely, yeah. I can well imagine sort of having to read through like all of these kind of different folios and things and kind of getting to that. Yeah, and out of curiosity of that, as well as kind of perhaps the more kind of technical difficulties of kind of accessing these kind of scripts, what do you think are sort of the opportunities and challenges of perhaps say diving into like say somebody's kind of notebooks or like their kind of guide to recipes and trying to sort of glean material from those?
Yeah. I mean, so my whole thesis was working on these. So about 50% of my 100 texts or manuscripts were these notebooks. And I'm taking that to be quite broadly because they would be actual recipe collections of like several hundred folios, or collections of like 3 or 4 folios, or even just randomly scribbled notes before and after a text. Uh, the opportunity there is that you get to see how different people approach the same bit of knowledge. So these Mercury
Mhm.
tricks I was talking about, they appear in everything, and clearly the different readers will have approached them differently. Richard's miscellany that opened the paper, it is a household book, and it's intended largely for household entertainment. He's got fables, he's got romances, he's got little plays in it. Like it, the whole book is intended for the diversion of his household. So that recipe in that context is for play.
Mhm.
In the 88 recipes of Rausis, where it's surrounded by alchemical recipes, recipes for fires, like inextinguishable fires, like amazing but clearly chemical and technical sites, are they for entertainment or are they for edification? Are they for like learning? So that's an opportunity like to get really not just to look at a recipe genre as a monolith, but to really explore how
Mhm.
individuals would have engaged with them. The challenge is finding the things and trying to decide and trying to decide if the context that they're in means they were experienced as magic tricks. So an example would be is that one of my magic tricks that I see frequently is to make birds either fall down dead or to catch them with your hands. Now that could just be a farming technique, right? So it's using hemlock. You're essentially poisoning the animals a little bit so you can grab hold of them. And when it's collected with experiment or recipes for remedies for farm animals or for farming, then that wouldn't necessarily be a magic trick. But if it's collected with other recipes for amusing effects, then maybe it is. And that same technique of drugging the animal was used in the 16th century by like one of our few um, early records of a magician in a court of one of the kings. He essentially drugged a pigeon, sent it up into the rafters, and timed his performance so that when he stabbed the picture of the pigeon, it would fall down dead. So it has been used as a magic trick, but it also has practical implications on the other side.
That's absolutely fascinating. Because I guess one would sort of assume that most of these things were just sort of for entertainment purposes. But the fact that they can also be sort of in a more practical sense, I think that's really fascinating. And I guess an immediate question follows on from that. Do you think necessarily you need kind of an audience and a spectacle for it to be classed as, say, a magical trick? Or do you think there's maybe other things that kind of play into that for it to be strictly categorized as such?
Yeah, so I that's really interesting. I spent quite a long time in my thesis trying to delineate what it is that a magic trick is.
Hmm.
Um, And in terms of the performance, so the performance of illusionist magic, I managed to whittle down, requires two things. It requires for the performer to be under no illusion that they are doing anything other than performing an illusion, and to not be trying to pretend to do anything more than that. And for the audience to also be completely aware of what they are watching is not anything magical, that it's intended to be the illusion of the impossible. So I guess in that case, you don't necessarily need the audience because the performer, in a bit like how children have magic trick boxes for themselves and they can practice it for themselves, and we understand them to be doing a magic trick even if they're not being witnessed. A performer, like an amateur in their home, could collect these recipes and do it themselves because they both, as performer and audience, understand what's occurring to be the affectation of the impossible, to be willfully trying to imitate the appearance of the impossible.
Mhm.
Now, if they were instead trying to actually capture some pigeons, then it's no longer a magic trick because
Yeah.
they're not intending it to present something as impossible.
I see. Right. That's really interesting. Just kind of having that kind of distinction there. Yeah, and I think it's fascinating the way that, like, the same technique can be applied in lots of different contexts. But obviously you need that kind of framework there to actually delineate it as such. And I suppose that leads on to another question. I suppose, obviously, with many of these tricks, the key idea was that people were performing an illusion, and that was kind of understood. They weren't sort of, say, invoking demonic rites or anything like that to be able to produce this kind of effect. Do we ever see any sort of interaction with, like, sort of magic as it was known, or was it always kind of kept quite separate from each other?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. So in my corpus of sources, because they are what people are writing down instructionally, you
Mhm.
don't tend to get that much of a of like comment on how they are being performed.
Yeah.
Now, in these more household notebook situations, you do tend to get the collection of magic tricks alongside what I'd call the common tradition of magic, or what is called. So that's things like charms, which sort of
Mm.
sit on a borderline. Like they're magic, but they're not trying to engage with any sort of demons, but they're still a little bit. Mm.
Mhm.
In other cases, you find, particularly in a clerical context, so clerics are more likely to collect magic, real magic with demons anyway. You might find them alongside recipes for contacting a demon so they can read the books for you so you don't have to. Um,
Mhm.
but there's never an indication in the recipe collections that the recipe to make a ring jump around the table is understood as being demonic in any way or intends to put on the appearance of being demonic in any way.
Mhm.
What you do get in like more theoretical writings is when I say theoretical, like theological, philosophical writings are writers like William O'Verne, who I spoke about before, Nicola Resme, and Roger Bacon, condemning performers who do magic tricks, so do sleight of hand, mess around with mirrors, and pretend that they are true magicians, and
Mhm.
also condemning the gullibility of their audiences for being fooled by such a spectacle.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's yes, I could well imagine that, like, both of those things on each end of the spectrum could definitely sort of get people into trouble. And do you get the impression that when people are trying to sort of understand, sort of trying to explain how these tricks work and how they do that, I appreciate that to some level there's an instructional element of it, but do you think there's also an element of kind of just showing, well, okay, no, this isn't something weird or supernatural. This is literally just, human skill.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, do you mean for the magic tricks, or do you mean for other nonsense?
Oh yes, for magic tricks especially.
Yeah, so there is the Secretum Philosophorum is the earliest attempt I have found of someone trying to say this is just a deception of the sense. This isn't anything. This isn't the magical art. It's someone else doing a thing. Haven't seen that happen again until Reginald Scott and Prevost come out and essentially say the same thing. Reginald Scott's discovery of witchcraft is all about how witchcraft belief is incompatible with religion and incompatible with logic. He doesn't believe the hype about witchcraft essentially, and he tries to disprove the existence of witches by disproving the miraculousness or the impossibility of certain acts. One of his several methodologies is by looking at magic tricks and juggler's tricks. So yeah, he's doing that sort of thing that you were saying. There is a tradition in the Middle Ages of books of wonder, however, which have things that are clearly magical, like creating candles made with snake skin that produce illusions of snakes, where they're kind of trying to do a similar thing. They're trying to collapse all of these wonderful phenomena into a very mechanical understanding of the world by thinking them through the lens of like occult properties of nature. So of course, a lamp made with snake is going to produce the image of a snake because of the natural sympathy between snakes and snakes. There are other older experiments where, for example, the semen of a donkey is used in the candle, and because semen is generative, obviously it would produce the effect of the appearance of a donkey outside of it because that makes logical sense in that context. But
Mhm.
that's a very, they don't tend to appear together so much. Those more learned almost like thought exercisey type of tricks,
Hmm.
and these more obviously chemical doable, or at least logically doable.
Absolutely, I see. That's really interesting. Another thing which I thought was fascinating was the way that there almost seemed to be links to kind of alchemical ideas with ways that, that mercury kind of produced life, or that, adding red or adding fire can kind of add vigor to something.
Mhm.
Um, I'm quite curious, like, would that maybe imply that, say ordinary craftsmen things might have some knowledge of kind of alchemical ideas? Or do you think this was just sort of practical knowledge? And then maybe people say, writing about it and perhaps imposing alchemical ideas onto this thing that they're observing.
No, no, absolutely. Alchemy and craft practice at this time, like they very much occupy overlapping circles. Because if you think about the processes, like the actual mechanical processes that alchemy has to do, right? The grinding of substances, their heating, and also its aims, right, to make gold. Well, that's not too dissimilar from craft, where you're grinding and heating substances, and where metal workers are trying to purify gold. They are using mercury to make gold, but that's just to extract the impurities from metal, right? So
Mhm.
their purposes, their techniques, and their substances are overlapping. At this time, so I think the work of Pamela Smith and Sylvie Nevin and Pamela Olong, they talk about the growing intersection between craftspeople and um, more educated individuals who would normally not be working with their hands, who start to be interested in working with their hands. So they start to exchange knowledge. And I think that's where this overlap occurs. I mean, I think this is also why you get some of these magic tricks in more technical, alchemical focused notebooks, because as they go into the workshop to discuss with craftspeople how they are heating the mercury, how they are grinding the sulfur, perhaps they're also
Yeah.
being shown amusing tricks, because if you're interested in substances, you're not just interested in them in one way, but you're broadly interested in their application.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that definitely makes sense. Just kind of seeing how everything works, then seeing, oh, you can also do this sort of stuff as well with this. And that, I guess, in turn, kind of tells you a bit more about their properties and the kind of potential that these substances can have.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, would I be right in thinking that most of this was fairly sort of grassroots stuff? This was maybe just say, people getting together and showing each other tricks or just practicing it on their own, or do you ever see individuals perhaps who on a slightly larger scale are kind of showing off these tricks?
Yeah. So in the manuscripts aren't clear as to the context of their performance.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, there are some implications. Again, like the Secretum Philipposaurus suggests an audience. So this was a text that was produced in a monastic university context by young clerics. So I don't think it's a far step to say that perhaps it was this person, this author compiler, put that together because in their context people were exchanging fun tricks. You occasionally get magic tricks appearing in like culinary texts. So, for example, in amongst actual recipes for food, you'll sometimes get recipes for making chickens dance around, or for making cooked meat appear raw, which again suggests that this is a, I think, quite small domestic entertainment as opposed to something happening on the stage.
Hmm.
Not to say they weren't. In some medieval romances, you do have uh, clearly they are magical entities, but the way that the scene is structured implies that they are a performer in that instance, so that the audience is reading them as performer. So there's a 12th century romance, Flora and Blanche Flora, which has a performer, Barbaran, again, clearly magical, that he performs entertaining tricks, and they have a lot of similarities to the magic tricks in my corpus. So I think there was overlapping circles. I think there was a common tradition and understanding of these chemical tricks, but I'm not so certain they were performed by professionals all the time.
Hmm.
That was sort of a roundabout answer.
Yeah. But I see what you mean. Yeah, there's that sort of overlap between, say, it being a sort of common tradition, but also just kind of
Hmm.
being something that was maybe done like on a small scale basis,
Yeah,
between people working together, or, like say at a big court or something where, that could be something that could accompany the overall spectacle.
yeah, absolutely. No, I don't think there was anyone like making a living out of them. Um, I think it would have to, their effects also, they're small effects. If there
Yeah.
are too many people in the room, you wouldn't be able to see them. So I imagine it is like it's small parties, gatherings. You know, if you get to a conference level, you're too big. Uh,
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. And I suppose just sort of going off from that, obviously the kind of the difference between, say, an audience in a set stage and say a small gathering, just kind of showing these things off, and maybe the slightly broader applications beyond just, say, illusion and entertainment,
mhm.
being the two other things. But I was wondering, do you think there are sort of any other kind of crucial differences and similarities between, like, say, this form of kind of magic and the kind of magic that people tend to enjoy today?
As in the chemical tricks and the performances that we,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think there are because there science and scientific principles are used today for entertaining tricks. I mean, there's quite a lot of stage magic that involves these like vast technological beasts, and there are people trying to do and like smartphone magic. So I do think it's
Mhm.
like part of human instinct to use the technology that's available to you at the time and play with it, to
Mhm.
demonstrate things playfully. So I think in that context, in which at what point does science and magic overlap, is a similarity that we have. But some of the tricks themselves are very similar. So the trick that I think I opened with, where a performer protects themselves from being burnt by using egg white and sulfur,
Mm.
that's got a modern version of with experiments where you put together water and ethanol to soak. If you've ever seen the trick where someone burns a piece of money but doesn't burn it, that's the same principle. The water protects the object while the combustive, while the alcohol burns off. And in the other one, the wetness of the egg whites that's sticky, so it sticks to the hand, protects the hand whilst the combustible material burns. And we have several like chemical tricks that happen on stages to make smoke or to make fire behave in weird ways. So I think there's still, and that's a very early way of doing magic. That's it's in a lot of chemical, a lot of like best boys tricks, those sort of like 19th century tricks for boys. You know, a lot of those are the
Oh
same
yeah,
tricks.
I see. That's really interesting. Yeah, and I guess there's the more kind of anthropological element of
Mhm.
kind of impressing people with illusions, but also just kind of seeing what other applications there are with technology beyond just like the formal.
Mhm.
And then, as you say, like it's fascinating how you get that kind of continuity as well, between, say, very early kind of magical tricks and like stuff that kids are still kind of learning further on
Yeah,
down the line.
and stuff that happens in laboratories for like not like research laboratories, but for examples like science demonstrations or science communications, or like in schools. At least as early as the 70s, one of the books I looked at in putting together my PhD was Chemical Magic for the Classroom, published in the 1960s, that has
Mhm.
similar recipes. So there's a recipe for bleaching a red rose white with sulfur, which also appears in my collections of recipes. The idea being that the sulfur uh, has some sort of reaction with the natural stuff in the rose and bleaches it white briefly, before that substance that's produced wears off. But it's the same.
See, it's amazing. Incredible how like some of these tricks just have such a long kind of shelf life and can
Yeah.
still be really popular today. That's yeah, absolutely fascinating. And do you find just sort of obviously you got sort of quite a kind of breadth of manuscripts chronologically. Are there any tricks that are particularly popular at particular times, or do you find it sort of quite consistent throughout?
Um, so it's quite, most of my manuscripts are 14th and 15th century, and I
Mhm.
find that they are broadly consistent with each other. My
Mhm.
earlier manuscripts, which I only have a handful, Richard's, leaving him aside because he's an anonymy, they tend to be more formal texts that contain more tricks that are copied from existing texts that are focused, for example, on fire or on the use of candles, um, which I guess because of their effects or because they're using quite difficult substances, so they're less related to the craft world. I would imagine that it's because it's before this time when artisanal craft is disseminating, out of the workshop away. So all they've got are these theoretical tracts on making inextinguishable fires or creating snakes in the home. But there's an influx into these craft substances from the 14th century that I see, particularly later on.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Hmm. And do you find are there any particular kind of blind spots or any areas that you'd like to sort of look into in more depth with kind of further research?
Yeah, absolutely. So my corpus is predominantly English. So of my 100 manuscripts, I've got 71 that are English and 29 that are European. And that's simply due to we were talking about before, how difficult these manuscripts are to work with because you need to physically be there. And for every 5 you look at, there's only one that's actually helpful, the nature of them. So for the course of a PhD, it wasn't viable to go sit in European libraries and do so, which means that I have few European examples, and where I do, they are predominantly formal texts in produced in institutional context, because they're the ones that are more likely to be digitized or well catalogued. And I'd be interested to look at, see if I can find domestic, particularly Italian and French, because those are, I look at later texts that are both Italian and French in the 16th century printed, to see if there are particular convergences or divergences into how magic tricks are collected in England, France, and Italy, and how that then compares with things like Scott and Provost, and with Della Porta in the Italian context, and other like cheap Italian books of secrets. Like, is this a lineal tradition like this, or are they a big old mess that are
Yeah,
overlapping with each other?
that'd be fascinating to see, like, sort of if they are sort of talking with one another, and if you can kind of
Mm,
see overlaps, or as you say, like if you get kind of different regional differences and different kind of particularities.
yeah. I mean,
Absolutely.
from substances alone, right? From the availability of certain substances in certain places, you'd expect there to be something of a distinction. For example, alum is used in my magic tricks quite frequently, but outside of the dye trade, I can't imagine why it would have been in England, whereas there were deposits of it in Italy. So,
Yeah,
or near Italy, I
absolutely.
think.
Definitely, yeah. And it'd be fascinating to kind of see from that, like, where it's more available,
Hmm.
where you get sort of things going on over there and sort of how that kind of contrasts to say, somewhere like say, the northern France, the Low Countries, where that was, completely different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm right in thinking that there's quite a bit of kind of continuity in the kind of the English sources, or do you find any kind of interesting kind of outliers or differences based on like sort of region?
So regionality of the manuscripts is quite hard. As far as I can see, the only real patterns I can draw across my manuscripts are based on setting and vocation. So, for example, my medical manuscripts that more likely belonged to a practicing physician as opposed to a medical person in an institution who was just studying medicine. They contain lots and lots of fire tricks that use sulfur, which was used in medical practice, and lots of plants that were also used in medical practice. In miscellaneous household collections, they tend to use household items, eggs, meat, stuff like dried blood, that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
And in the technical collections that are in institutional environments, everything appears in a formal text largely. And when they are in less institutional environments, they're in formal texts and they collect very broad ranges of broadly chemical things.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I suppose just sort of using what was most available and what could kind of then be used to that
Yeah.
effect.
I think also the accessibility of books, right? Because if you're an institution, you have access. So if you're in Monster University, if you have a desire to create your own recipe collection, you've got sources from which to copy them literally at your fingertips because you've got an institutional library. Whereas if you're an
Mhm.
individual, you're relying on access to borrowed books or even word of mouth. So your collection, I think, is always going to be a bit more chaotic, just because it's
Yeah.
much more serendipitous, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And just sort of coming towards the end of our talk, if our viewers want to learn a bit more about this particular field, or just sort of generally sort of magic tricks, in the Middle Ages, where would you recommend kind of the best places or the best kind of books to start with?
For magic tricks in the Middle Ages, that
Hmm.
is a toughie because it's a difficult subject to get into. I think so. It's an oldie but a goodie. But William Amon's Secrets and the Science and the Secrets of Nature, or something like that. That's about books of secrets. It's predominantly an early modern take on them, unprinted, but he does go further back into the Middle Ages and talks about this idea of producing wonder and the combination of substances, which is great. There's Bruno Roy's article, and this is an old article from the 80s, called The Household Encyclopedia as Magic Kit. And that is a great overview of two texts that have magic tricks within them, and the comparison of the effects of those texts to the performances of characters in literature. So he tries to argue that these collections that are part of a wider circulation of recipes, that are trying to emulate the performances almost playfully, like no one's being like, I want to be exactly like them, but joyfully trying to copy. Mm-hmm. And other than that, anything on the Secretum Philosophorum. So Robert Golding has a famous article on it called Deception of the Senses, or Trickery and Deception, the Secretum Philosophorum. Robert Golding, you can find it. It's a great book it's a great article that tries to look at ideas of experiment, deceit, and playfulness within this text, and then within 13th and 14th century English culture in general.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm afraid that brings us to the end of our time today. Real pity to us. I think there's so many other kind of areas that one can branch off of. I think that's one thing that's struck me so much about this particular talk. Just the fact that, we've started with one particular field, and yet it can just teach us so much just by branching out and exploring more. That's been absolutely fantastic. So, Vanessa, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be here.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for watching. Hope you join us for the next interview. Take care.